Welcome back to the AstroInsights podcast. In today's episode, we'll be focusing on the Centaurs, a hybrid group of comet-like asteroids gravitationally dislodged from the Kuiper belt that serve as the bridge between small planetesimals and fully fledged planets. The first of these, Chiron, was discovered in 1977. Chariklo, his celestial counterpart, was discovered by astronomers 20 years later in 1997. The astronomer responsible for discovering Chiron chose to name this new class of space object after the mythical Centaurs because of their hybrid nature, but also because most of them orbit between Saturn and Uranus, something that's reflected in Chiron's mythical ancestry as the son of Kronos and the grandson of Uranus. Since then, a handful of astrologers, including Melanie Reinhardt, have elected to work with a core selection of these halflings. Today, I'll be talking to Sarah Whitridge, who has chosen to focus her astrological practice on Chariklo, Chiron's celestial and mythical companion. Sarah Whitridge is an intuitive astrologer and founder of Studio Chariklo, a creative space which supports her work in astrology, counseling, homeschool parenting, and writing. Her work channels the archetype of Chariklo, the sacred witness, offering clients a compassionate, non-intrusive container for transformation. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Lots to talk about, but maybe you could just start by giving listeners a sense of how you got into astrology and what your journey was to working with Chariklo.
Yes, absolutely. So let's see. So I discovered astrology around the age of 15. And for me at that time, my father had just died a few days before my 15th birthday. And my mother was preparing a memorial service for him. And so my brother and I went to go and live with a friend of hers to give some space. And this wonderful friend of hers put a book in front of me and said, I have a funny feeling that you might love this. And it was an enormous book of the sun signs. And I really appreciated at the time her coming in and sort of recognizing that I would love to read about this during a moment of grief. And I devoured that book from the front to the back. And, you know, as a child, a teenager going through grief, reading those archetypes was incredible for me. I'm a Scorpio. And so, you know, at the time I was sort of reading all about grief and death. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, I'm going through this moment and this is meaningful. This is perhaps maybe something that I'm meant to go through. And so, you know, I continued the love of astrology just by observation of really feeling and watching those archetypes move through the people around me for many, many years. And then in 2012, I had my first baby, and I was living in Maine at the time in the United States. And I met an amazing astrologer just after that, and it fueled my passion again for astrology. It hadn't always left, but I hadn't always felt growing up in the UK that I had a permission in the culture to really follow this kind of eccentric path. So I felt the culture in the US really allowed me to explore myself deeper. And I met this wonderful astrologer and continued to study. And then in 2017, I began more formal training. And that, you know, it was fantastic. And then, let's see, I set up Studio Chariklo because I'd done a research project on this particular asteroid. And from there on, I've just kind of embraced her meaning and her beauty and her groundedness and her space to bring a new kind of um, level of the feminine to people's astrology charts, their natal charts.
Okay. So what drew you to Chariklo in the first place? What was it about the archetype that made you want to work strongly with her?
Mm, yeah, that's a really good question because I first heard about Chariklo when Pam Gregory and Melanie Reinhardt were doing an interview together. And there was something when Pam Gregory described Chariklo, there was something that was very visceral in my body that
Mhm.
I needed to know more. One of the descriptions that she said about Chariklo was that, she's there silently within us. She's waiting to be called into service. And the key thing for me was that she'd said that anything not of love falls away. And at the time, I had done something called a ministry training, um,
Mhm.
a minister of walking prayer. And I had gone into working briefly into hospice on the island that I currently live. And
Uh-huh.
there was something about Chariklo and what I'd been doing that deeply resonated. I was, when you're in working in hospice, or you're working with grief, or you're working in areas of death and dying, there
Mhm.
is this amazing way of being that really, where you really embody Chariklo. It's this kind of silent witness. And so from there, I felt that she has kind of been tracking with me. She's actually
Mhm.
sat on my midheaven right now.
Oh,
So
well.
she's very visible in my presence, in my work. And yeah, it's really interesting actually because folks who come for a natal reading with Chariklo,
Mhm.
they say the same thing, Lisa. It's amazing. They're like, I've just learned about this amazing asteroid, Chariklo, and I just intuitively feel there is something here that I can relate to. And
Mhm.
I hear that so often. So I think that there's a part of Chariklo that deeply initiates us into our intuition.
Mm. Interesting. I mean, I thought it was fascinating that when I approached you to do this interview, that transiting Neptune was going over my natal Chariklo. So this definitely seems to be something about the Chariklo transits that sort of activated certain like points in people's life that almost kind of call for that particular type of energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Because she's so subtle, like her energy is really subtle, and
Hmm.
there's lots of sort of words around Chariklo, like invisible, and the caretaker of the
Hmm.
invisible field. She really is that aspect of ourselves that steps back and observes. And I think that because of that, we do feel her intuitively. And therefore, when we're looking at a natal chart with Chariklo, when she's on those main points, right? When she's
Hmm.
on the angles, or she's next to the sun, or she's next to the moon,
Hmm.
and or the nodes, we really have a sense that something is alive in the world with this exquisite space holder.
Yes. And it's interesting too that you talked about grief and end of life. It's almost like those important rites of passage or those sort of big moments of like suffering or grief where you need healing seems to sort of call her in. And I think, and it does seem as though there's a reason why she's paired with Chiron. And I wondered if you might sort of be able to talk to that as well in terms of her mythology, because a lot of our listeners may not know anything about Chiron and Chariklo and the mythology of their sort of relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Greek myth is really interesting. Um, so Chariklo is said to have been, before she met Chiron, her husband, who we know as the healer, or the wounded healer.
Hmm.
Before that, she was actually a nymph. She's described as either a wood nymph or a water nymph,
Hmm.
which really describes to me her direct connection with nature.
Yes.
She really is with us in the shift in natural cycles.
Mm.
And then she meets Chiron. I mean, so much of the myth we don't know, and so it's this chance really to sort of allow us to interpret here.
Hmm.
She meets Chiron, who's a centaur, and so the curiosity here is, wow, is there some cross cultural marriage? Is there ability to shapeshift? Did she go from nymph to centaur?
Hmm.
Anyway, they're together, and she becomes a mother, and she's also a foster mother, right, to some of the well-known healers, um, like Asclepius and Achilles. And so she is with Chiron, and we know that he was wounded
Yes.
for 900 years.
Yes.
So you can imagine he is this stalwart, sort of amazing figure, witnessing Chiron in his pain and his suffering and his work before he becomes mortal, of course. Um, and that just says so much, right?
Mm.
She's almost like the healer of the healer, because she's in the background, but she's so powerful. So we're really having this opportunity for a feminine archetype that speaks to those who do the work behind the scenes, who are so
Mm.
vastly important. And that so often that there is like this person at the front, and there's always someone incredibly intuitive and thoughtful and powerful and healing behind them. We're really seeing a
Mm.
creative partnership here. Yes, one
Yes.
presents at the front, and there's someone perhaps that we might perceive is behind, but who's doing the work? So
Yes.
they
Yes.
really are a pair. And the in Greek, we can sort of roughly translate the meaning of the name Chariklo. It's charis, meaning grace, and klotho, meaning to spin or to weave.
Mm.
Um, and I think that this is really key. She's this grace spinner, or she who spins, or she who brings grace spinning through our lives. And
Mm.
it makes me kind of think about a lot of the creation stories or the origin stories that we know from around the world. Often there are women who are weaving, or they are creating some in
Yes.
quotes sort of domestic activity, right? So it's kind of this it's really like a metaphor that Chariklo is here to weave her special space and peace and harmony through our lives. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it reminds me of the Greek fates, that used to spin
exactly.
the moirai, and there is this element of kind of coming in and coming out, that she seems to be
Mhm.
liminal. Sometimes there's quite a strong presence, and sometimes there isn't. But I think, what's so interesting about her, in terms of what you were saying about the creation myths, is, is that quote in the Timaeus that Plato talks about. He talks about the world's soul,
Mhm.
um, where he says that out of that of which all things are generated comes from the nurse, the receptacle, that we may liken to a mother or a womb that partakes of the intelligible but is yet most incomprehensible. And Timaeus says, of this receptacle and nurse of all creation, we have only this dreamlike sense, being unable to cast off sleep and determine the truth about it. And there does, as you say, there seems to be this ethereal aspect to Chariklo, that she seems to be able to move, perhaps like her orbit between Saturn and Uranus, between this very safe cocoon-like structure that she spins or she weaves around you. But then on the other hand, she sort of, at other times, she seems to sort of fade into the background, exactly as you say, and becomes this much more dreamlike presence that's not quite, that's a little bit more ethereal, like um, I think we kind of talked about this a little bit when I was saying that, in the original astrology, Saturn was considered to be the first orbit that was associated with time and therefore with the realm of the material. Whereas anything above Saturn, like, Uranus sort of onwards, or I guess in astronomical terms, further out into space would be a lot more ethereal. And like Chiron, she also orbits between these two planets. And it does seem as though that's also a really important part of her job, is to weave between Saturn, the symbol of time and of the tradition and the old, and then Uranus, which is of course the new, but also what feels severed or separated or split. Because there's always that aspect of Uranus that is quite that cuts things off, and it does seem, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you can talk to the types of issues that people you find come to you with prominent Chariklos in their chart, but it does seem as though very often she seems to appear when there's some kind of crisis, or where people are feeling very isolated, or there's been a huge loss, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you've made so many good points. And just to speak to this first, what I find so interesting about Chariklo is that she's
Huh?
has a very stable orbit, right? So she's
Ah.
moving through Saturn and Uranus, and she doesn't cross over any of the orbits of the classical planets. That's why at the beginning I was talking about intuition, because she's really interacting with us, like you're saying, on this kind of like invisible plane. And sometimes we can feel her, and sometimes she seems, more distant. And I find this really interesting because I think it's sort of this invisible, sort of slightly reserved, maybe silent personality within Chariklo is something that we really need to cultivate, I think, within ourselves.
Yes, and we
And so,
undervalue.
yes, and we
Yes.
undervalue. And I think that when folks have this sort of connection to Chariklo, and we're looking at times and transits and points in their lives where there has been this deep separation, let's say that, like a
Hmm.
separation of something, whether that is a grief, a job, a home, a lover, and we know that often she's there as this kind of silent witness. Um, and we go through these points that are deeply challenging in our lives. Of course we do. We're human. And some folks have said that at those particular points, they have felt some being, some sense that someone else was there, like someone just holding that quiet space, for them to move completely through the grief, the pain, and the suffering. And so it takes me back to the point you made earlier about Chariklo being there at times when we are going through immense transitions.
Yes.
Um, and that's why so many I see her very prominent in charts of people who are therapists, or
Mhm.
they're behind the scenes policymakers. I can't forget a time of talking to a man who was in his Chariklo return. And through his entire life, he had taken care of salmon and the ecology, and the environment around the salmon. And
Mhm.
it was his passion to look after not only the salmon, but the environment around it. And that to me also speaks of this quality of Chariklo connecting with humans, but also connecting with nature, right? Also
Yes.
coming through, because I think that so many of us can actually feel Chariklo when we are in nature, when we are in silence. And when you were speaking to me about, having these transits that feel painful, I see so often that people have gone through a period of silence in themselves, without really knowing how that can be applied through an astrological lens. It's like I
Mm.
removed myself from this situation, and I stepped into a place where I could begin to understand myself, where I can be with myself, where I
Mm.
can connect with nature, where I can have silence to begin to take apart the sort of
To
uh,
process, sort of
yeah, it's a
thing.
process. Yeah, it is. And there's so much
A-
within our culture that can feel oppressive.
yes, yes.
Whether that's coming from parents or jobs or society or whatever that might be. And Chariklo really helps us get down to the essence of things.
And to integrate, I think, in that sense, she seems to work with. So Chiron almost is that wound, and the sort of the pain of whatever experience we're sort of going through, and then she bears witness, but she also provides space, like the therapist or the healer, without necessarily interfering, so that Chiron can then go through this process of internal integration and processing. So it's almost this dual um, thing that's happening at the same time. It's really interesting. And what I also found fascinating about what you're saying is that what she's reminding us of is the same thing as the Platonic world soul, which is that soul is not in us; we are in soul. Like the
Mhm.
whole sort of ecosystem, the sort of the bigger world that we live in is actually it's all in soul, it's all sacred, and it's so easy to forget that in a world that is so dualistic and that is so filled with distraction and kind of chaos um, and where we get so easily disconnected both from our bodies and from each other and from nature.
Yes, absolutely. And when we're in that place of bodily disconnection, how can we hear ourselves? How can we
Yes.
know what we want? How can we know our next best steps? So she really is this magic of subconscious healing. And what you're saying in relation to Chiron, they're really working together, and I feel that there is a pulse that they move in and out. I mean, we can use the word trauma, so well now. Everybody kind of understands this kind of
Mm.
world of trauma, and unraveling that which has hurt you takes time. It
Mm.
takes time, and sometimes it might feel like it never ends. But each time we come back and around to face the pain, it's like healing is not linear. It's cyclical. It's a
Yes.
spiraling motion, and so each time we come back round to confront it, um, perhaps we're looking at it from a different facet or a different angle, or something else has come in to support us, and I feel this is where Chariklo and Chiron are weaving through our lives constantly. It really is. It's
Yes.
needed. It's needed because it has to happen like that, because the mind will work on one level, but the body absolutely needs time to catch up. We're so
Yes.
front-brained
Yes.
all the time, helping us balance. I mean, that's exactly what Chariklo and Chiron are doing here as well, to try and help us balance, right? So Chiron is often sort of thought as more yang, and Chariklo is the yin,
Yes.
and we need both of these things, and especially now.
Yes, and also I think what you were saying as well about slowing down, that these two particular archetypes do seem to force us to slow down, whether it's trauma and wounding or whether it is this need for space and for healing. And I think that was something that really came to the fore in 2020 when we had the global lockdown. So what I found so fascinating was that when I started researching Chariklo, that she had this conjunction with Saturn and Pluto in January of 2020, which was the same time and which most astrologers associate with the beginning of COVID. And
Mm.
so, and then, and then sort of like looking back at three main Saturn-Pluto conjunctions that we've had in the 20th and the 21st century, which are 1914 to 15, and then again in 1947, 48, and then more recently, 2019 to 2020, is that there seems to be an interesting rhythm with that she kind of comes in at these moments that are not just, you might see Chiron as the individual wound, but the Saturn Pluto seems to create these collective, devastating wounds like epidemics, wars, that sort of thing, which almost break down the social order and the structures that we've come to rely on and force us into this liminal space where we are, which can be very traumatic. And it's so interesting that often what comes into that space are these new things, which Chariklo almost seems to help to birth. So yeah, I mean that's what drew me to find out more about Chariklo, because I kind of thought, as a society, we've been through this devastating period where we've had to sort of like come to terms with death, which is something that in the West we don't really talk about a lot.
Mhm.
And we're so obsessed with, the idea of health and of hacking our health and of, patch it up and find quick ways to keep ourselves going so that we can just continue to be productive and stay on the hamster wheel. And because we're so overly mentally stimulated. And, from what you're saying, it sounds like she does force you to slow down, and so does Chiron. And, on a collective level, these Saturn Pluto transits, seem to, also punctuate, almost like death, in the sense that, what you were talking about with the hospice work and stuff. I find it interesting, for example, that the Chariklo return happens at the age of 62, 63.
Mhm.
So it's quite late in life. And it is when you're really coming to terms with your mortality and also your legacy, where maybe you're thinking about yourself less as an individual and more about how you integrate into the community. So again, what you were saying about that sense of widening your perspective a little bit, but also slowing down, because often people retire around about that time. And there really
Mm.
seems to be something, in that. A former lecturer of mine, she happened to have a Chariklo return at that Saturn Pluto conjunction in 2020. And it was about that time that she had, she kind of retired from teaching and that sort of thing and moved to Glastonbury and was forced to slow down because she had sort of really bad episodes of debilitating tinnitus. So she couldn't carry on the hamster wheel. She was forced to kind of slow down. So
Yes.
is that similar to what you see in clients?
Yes, absolutely. And, I think about illness. Illness is sort of this precursor of death. And we are in our culture, we don't talk about death very much. And that is certainly changing. When I did a death doula training and a death vigil training recently,
Mhm.
here where I live on Orcas Island in Washington in the US, we set up a group called the Orcas Island Threshold Collective, because we want to bring death to the forefront of people's consciousness, and like we have a death film festival, we have Death Cafe, but it's still something that is really deeply at the core of what we're frightened of. And illness
Yes.
is that precursor. And I think
Mm.
Chariklo accompanies illness because really, when we think about it, when else do we slow down? When do we
Yes.
slow down? When have we ever really got time? And, maybe if you take a sabbatical, but even that's reduced to, its original form or, things like that. I see illness as this way, this forced rest, like you said, a way
Mm.
of really beginning to slow down. And when you have an illness, you begin to reframe life. You begin to reframe what is your values, what's important to you. You spoke to sort of lineage, and it really begins to open a pathway for a new way of thinking that is really, really important. So Chariklo becomes this bridge. She has this sort of bridging quality. It's not
Mm.
that she's causing the illness, but she's there, just as you were saying, when COVID happened, she's right there with these deeply cathartic planets, that even when that hits you in a natal chart, my goodness, it's this.
Mhm.
It's a real reckoning moment. And how I see Chariklo is to bring, just as Pam Gregory said, this unconditional love. Because we have to remember in illness that, there's an up leveling or there's something happening on a cellular level that's internally changing us just as much as we can, mentally control what happens to us in our day to day. And so many people have huge revelations
Mm.
when they're ill or they're sick or they're poorly, and
Yes.
that is part of her. That's part of why she's here as well. It's okay to be ill. It's okay to have these moments where we pause, but it's so hard for the human mind to settle down and surrender
Mm.
to an extent or accept, and of course that depends on the illness that you have. But you hear so many incredible stories of people navigating illness. And I can just share my own story here that when Chariklo has been sort of weaving backwards and forwards across my midheaven, I've had a recent diagnosis of Lyme disease.
Mhm.
I can look back now and see that I was having a Neptune's web when I got bitten, and I never knew
Uh-huh.
that I got bitten. And, it was all sort of very vague at the time. And then I went through a Pluto square. And that's when I began to first feel some deeply intense symptoms. And it's an odd disease, Lyme disease. It's accompanied with various other bacteria, and the more that you leave it, more other viruses kind of come into the body in this sort of weakened state. And so I've had Lyme disease, as I figured out, for the last 6 years. And it's just this year that I've actually had a diagnosis. And I can't tell you, Lisa, like during that time, how often on some days, I couldn't move my legs, I couldn't walk, and I was in
Mm.
bed. Um, and I have two children and a partner and, a
Gosh.
life
Mm.
that I was really not living
Yes.
and desperately trying to, but in this real sort of like strange Chiron-Chariklo-esque movement, I was going in and out of symptoms because these viruses, they go
Yes.
dormant in the liver and sometimes they don't present and sometimes they
Yes.
do. And there's this weaving. Um, and
Yes.
it's extraordinary. And it's been quite the process to go through, but it's brought me to some absolutely sweet moments of surrender.
Yes, well, I think this is the key, isn't it? Is the surrender, because this is something that our society, number one, and our minds won't let us do. And so often that's what's required to actually allow the healing to take place, because so much of it is just allowing the body to do what it does best, to make space so it can do that work. And also, the other thing that I was drawn to while you were kind of talking was, um, you were saying about this aspect of Chariklo where she tends to be in the background and that sort of stuff. And it reminded me so much of how during 2020 and COVID and that sort of thing, that there were all these caregivers in the background
Mm.
who suddenly kind of come to the fore, like, these nurses or these people that take care of you, or that were doing all this work behind the scenes to care for the sick and the dying and the elderly. And while we couldn't necessarily get to them.
I don't know, maybe this is my wishful thinking, but our children and our
Mhm.
elders, the beginning and the end of our life,
Yes.
are the most important humans to be caring for. And the people who are
Mm.
caring for them need to be valued
Yes.
monetarily, expressing gratitude for these people, just like you were saying during COVID. Um,
Yes, well, I mean, no, you're absolutely right. And I'm just sort of wondering how you felt the presence of Chariklo in your life at those times, like when you were feeling ill.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think at that time, sort of halfway through, I became aware of Chariklo. And so I really actively sought out her archetype and really
Mm.
began to layer that archetype within my life. I live on an island and I so it's interesting that at the same time that I got Lyme, I then moved to a much more simpler life. Living on
Mhm.
an island requires you to um, live a certain lifestyle. And it is one of simplicity. And in that sense, my family were here during the lockdown and COVID, and the silence.
Mm.
It's already fairly quiet here, but the silence was just unbelievable. And then I think about how Chariklo, again, weaving her through the natural world, what did that time that when humans stop, what did that do to nature? Things could catch up.
Yes, and air clarity is improving where there would been pollution because there was no traffic and all of
Yes.
that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
It's
it was
very true.
the great standstill, wasn't it? It's just like it was like an absolute Chariclo moment of just staying put and standing still. So I really monitor my own life and weave Chariklo through where I can. It's been easy, I should say. It's been quite easy with Lyme because I'm forced to stop.
Yes.
But I hope that on my recovery that I do begin to recognize. I feel like I've activated a muscle now to recognize when I've done too much. And I just really called Chariklo in it to just
Mm.
show me this way. She is this celestial shepherd. And so it doesn't surprise me that she was there. When I saw that too, she has a relationship, certainly with Pluto and Saturn. I feel that there is something really significant there. There's often I'm not even sure how I would describe it particularly, but I feel like, these are her pals, Chiron's her husband, Saturn and Pluto are her pals because they work together, quite well. And we need Chariklo to bring in that sort of softening, right? That cocooning that you
Yes,
were saying.
after those very harsh transits. And it's interesting
Yeah.
in terms of when these classical astrological rites of passage happen. So, like, for example, with the Pluto square, which is the first of the midlife transits, it's followed by that really challenging Uranus opposition. But then we have Chiron come in after that. And then we've got the second Saturn return, and then it's followed by Chariklo.
Mhm.
So it's really interesting, and these planets, a lot of them have to do with old age or with rites of passage, with transitions, and these are all major times of transition. At midlife, when your body starts to change, you get the first sort of intimations of mortality, and then a little bit further on, where you now having to make peace with the fact that maybe some of your close family have passed on just purely due to like age, and
Mhm.
then you're having to make friends with your own mortality as you get to the Chariklo stuff. So
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. I just want to say to something that you would just to add on something quickly there, which we haven't got to yet is she is this she is balancing the tension, right? She's
Mhm.
balancing this tension. She's bringing this in. And so that leads us to understanding that Chariklo was discovered in a 6-point star. She was discovered in the
Yes.
Star of David, right? At
Yes.
6 degrees of
Yes.
Leo. And that uncommon, pattern, the nature of the 6-pointed star is part of Chariklo's magic. This sacred geometry gets activated. It's, that 6-pointed star was all in air and fire signs. And
Yes.
that's very much here. She's balancing the tension, and that's reflected in her discovery.
Yes. So she was discovered on the 15th of February 1997, for those who don't know. And Melanie Reinhardt always tells this wonderful story about how she was doing some astrology work in South Africa at the time. And at the end of the day, she went and she had a look at the transits for the day, and she saw this wonderful and very unusual Star of David forming with sextiles, almost creating a hexagon around it. And one point was missing. And she thought, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if there was something at that point to complete the geometry? And then, of course, she discovered not long afterwards that that was the same weekend that Chariklo was discovered, and she was in that position, which finished off this beautiful geometric shape.
Yes, and thank you for bringing Melanie into this discussion, because Melanie Reinhardt, who was so helpful to me during my research, and we've kept in touch, and we're still in touch,
Hmm.
and we're still, you know, talking about Chariklo and all the things. And, I love that she sort of popped up in this beautiful synchronicitous way. And I think that we can really, as much as we talk about Chariklo being in and around all these transitional times in our lives, it's so important to remember that she's also here to bring in synchronicity, right? To bring in this unconditional love, as we've spoken to, which really speaks to that 6-pointed star, and Star of David obviously being connected with or associated with the heart,
Yes.
and that she was discovered in Leo and ruling the heart, and it's
Yes.
like we can't forget that she was discovered in Leo, and that Leo is play and joy, and she
Yes.
is when we hold tension for the things that are hard in our lives, the tension is played out through the opposite, just really trying to bring in balance of what brings us grief. We can also bring that in equal measures to something that brings us joy. It's
Yes.
these parts of life that we need to bring into balance. And so I love that Chariklo is there in Leo. She is this courageous midwife. I always forget that she's sort of midwifing us, really, in this
Yes.
heartfelt way, right? She's not afraid of transitions, and she is this beautiful, quiet strength.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it's true actually, and it reminds me of you were talking earlier about your experience with illness, and I remember this so well when I was a teenager actually, of having appendicitis, and for months I didn't know what was wrong with me. I just didn't feel right, and I felt a bit nauseous. I was having sort of like strange pains in my gut, and eventually, went to the doctor and um, was diagnosed with appendicitis and put into hospital. And I remember um, the moment before I went into surgery, I'm absolutely terrified of
Mm.
hospitals and particularly needles and that sort of thing. I've got a really deeply embedded phobia around needles, and I remember weeping and weeping and weeping because I was so scared of having this operation.
Mm.
And then after I'd cried and cried and cried, I sort of cried myself out, and then I kind of came to this real moment of peace. You know, I just felt that I was ready to accept my fate and that I would be all right,
Mm.
no matter like what happened.
Oh.
And I remember kind of waking up after the operation in the hospital, and this friend of mine was sitting there, a really good friend of mine, and I was too sleepy to actually talk to her. I kind of kept going in and out of consciousness, but she just sat there with
Mm.
me, and it was such a reassuring and kind of beautiful feeling, you know, that we didn't have to talk, but it was so lovely to have her there. And, you know, I didn't know that she was coming either. So it was this lovely surprise too. So this element of Leo. And in fact, I think she might have been a sun Leo. So yeah, it's so interesting. And then when I got better, you know, having this immense feeling of gratitude of like, this is what it actually feels like to be well. And, you know, as you were saying, that sense of that counterpoint of like, sometimes we have to get sick in order to remember how wonderful it feels to be well again, because we take it for granted so much.
Absolutely.
And, you know, and when we are well, that feeling of joy and of like, oh, you know, I can do this again, where we start to appreciate things that maybe we hadn't. So she definitely does seem to bring in this sense of gratitude and this love of life, which are all very Leo qualities, you know,
Yeah.
very much that heartfelt and also very creative energy.
Mm. Yes, exactly. And it reminds me of something that I just wrote really briefly while we were researching about Chariklo. And I was like, you know, what is she when we relate her to how we live? How do we embody her? You know, and I thought to myself, she is really like, she's a net. I wrote that. I'm just reading here from my journal. I put, she's a cool flannel on a fevered forehead. She is stepping, when we step into the snowy footprints of the elder in front of us. She is being treasured, the feeling of being treasured. She is a return call of reassurance from a boat in the fog, and the return call of the other boat through the fog that we cannot see. She's the beam from the lighthouse. She's hot chocolate on a cold winter's day after a big walk. She's an open fire to cold toes. She's a settling and a streamlining. She's a comfort blanket, and she's the silence after the storm. She's a ray of sunshine after a week of rain, a deep pause. She's a tea break in the workday of life, and she's the moment after the outbreath. And I think like that's where we're at. Maybe that's what you're saying. After COVID, are we in this outbreath?
Yes.
And are we ready to
Exhale.
to hear her? Yeah, to exhale and to reap the sort of gentle beauty of what suffering and challenging can be internally.
In the final episode of this series, which will be made available to Apple Podcast and AstroInsights blog subscribers in December, Sarah and I take an in-depth look at the charts of several well-known people who we feel embody the Chiron and Chariklo dynamic. Join us as we consider how repeating themes relating to these centaurs, including the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, Star of David aspect patterns, leo-aquarius axis, and the Saturn-Uranus dynamic, all play out through the individual astrology charts, creating personal narratives that are both revealing and healing. Could these case studies hold clues as to how we can gracefully navigate the difficult and challenging times we currently live in, post-COVID?